Welcome back. Last month on Juneteenth, in gratitude for the sacrifice of the African ancestors who built what is now Van Cortlandt Park, the African burial ground in the park was declared sacred. Joining us now to discuss this and more are Stephanie Ehrlich, Executive Director of Van Cortlandt Park Alliance, Peggy King Jorde, Cultural Projects Consultant, and Nick Dembowski, President of Kingsbridge Historical Society. Welcome all. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Of course. So let's start with Nick. Nick, can you share a little bit of the history of Van Cortlandt Park's African burial grounds, and how did you begin your research to discover more below the surface at the park?
So my research began as a park goer, and I noticed there were these headstones lying next to the Van Cortlandt House Museum that dated back to the 1700s, and I wanted to know more about them. So I did some research and learned that there was a burial ground that was established by the early colonists in the park, the Tippett and the Betts family. And I was up in the Westchester County Archives researching the history of that burial ground, and I ran into another person who was writing a book on Bronx cemeteries. And I said, well, do you know about this one here in Van Cortlandt Park? And he didn't. But when he looked into it, he found a record in a 1910 newspaper, the Mount Vernon Daily Argus, that said that when a railroad was put through Van Cortlandt Park in the 1800s, that skeletons were unearthed, and that these were supposed to be, according to the article, the slaves of the neighboring estates. And this confirmed what I had basically chalked up to local lore, that there was this burial ground for enslaved people in the park, and that set me on my own research path to try to find primary source documents, documents from the time that those skeletons were unearthed, to prove that that burial ground was indeed, used for enslaved Africans.
Wow. Thank you for sharing, Nick. And I saw the article. It was like a little clipping. So without that piece of history, how could we trace that back? So thank you for sharing that and restepping those for us. So Peggy, you've worked on advocating for marginalized histories and burial grounds for the past 30 years, including here in the States with Mayor Dinkins and the African Burial Ground National Monument here in New York City and abroad. Can you share the importance of this work and discuss what led you to Van Cortlandt?
Well, what led me to Van Cortlandt was the Van Cortlandt Parks Alliance's willingness, by way of Stephanie Ehrlich and before her Margot Perron, to see that there was a deficiency in the historical narrative of what was happening with the Van Cortlandt mansion and that whole historical narrative. And that if there was going to be a reckoning and then there was going to be a re-envisioning of the park and anything that was happening in the park, that this history had to be a part of it. And what's pleasing to me is that that was the legacy of the African burial ground downtown and its importance. The fact that the African burial ground really set or laid the groundwork for real community engagement and how it is that the community was going to be able to impact, how their story was going to be told, as well as scholarship and curriculum going forward. And so this was really important. That's what makes it very important.
Thank you, Peggy. And Stephanie, recently Van Cortlandt Park Alliance, as we mentioned, took the initiative to consecrate this burial ground on Juneteenth. What does this mean for the park and community, and why was it so pertinent to do this now?
So while Van Cortlandt Park Alliance did take a leading role, it is absolutely a community effort. And so working with Kingsbridge Historical Society with my colleague Nick and Peggy King Jorde, and also Van Cortlandt House Museum and community members, two women in particular, Jackie Fisher and DePrater, we were able to do this consecration, and it was absolutely the right moment. There was a lot of momentum to get signage created, which will be installed very, very soon. And there are a lot of people in the neighborhood who have felt this in their bones, that this was sacred space, and now was the right moment to do it.
Thank you, Stephanie. And speaking of those signs that are coming up, one of those things is for the beautiful mill pond, recently renamed Hester and Piero's Mill Pond. It also has its connections to African ancestors. Nick, can you share more about that story?
Oh, sure. So the mill pond, before there was a pond, or people recently called it a lake, it was just a stream. It was Tippett's Brook. And that was dammed up in the early 1700s to power these mills that the Van Cortlandt family owned. Now, like any large construction project from that time, it wasn't the Van Cortlandt family damming that stream. It would have been their enslaved African workforce here on Van Cortlandt Plantation. And, adding to the significance of the space, it's not just the beauty of the spot, but also the fact that the Van Cortlandt family owned an enslaved African miller. They enslaved an African miller named Piero, and his wife's name was Hester, and they very likely lived right there by the lake in their mills. And when you think about it even further, that's right next to the burial ground. There's this mill pond that was created by the enslaved Africans. There was the enslaved African miller and his family living there, and there is this burial ground, and it just creates, in all likelihood, this spot was a very important spot for that early African community in the neighborhood because of the significance of all those places.
Thank you for that. And Peggy, in a recent panel, you spoke about something called the weaponization of development. Here in Van Cortlandt, I know Nick and the Kingsbridge Historical Society have fought to prevent trail pavement and the construction of a tennis court, for instance, on historic land. Can you share more about this and how these types of developments lead to erasure of history?
Well, development by its nature, and let's just take the African burial ground downtown when the federal government had plans to build an office building. A developer comes to the table with a set of priorities and programming, but it's never set in stone because you don't know what you're going to encounter when you go to a site. And so what communities need to understand, because sites like these are only protected by community, people who come out and say, this is important to us, this is what is significant to our community, and particularly where it concerns marginalized and descended communities, because these are voices that weren't often heard. But downtown, when you talk about that development, you're talking about an office building. That particular office building was funded by public monies. That's why the public has a voice. And so people should recognize that when developers go into communities, that they should have an understanding of how the site was used over many years, whether it was a nuclear, plant or whether it was an African burial ground, and that the development is weaponized when they refuse to make room for communities at the table to say, all right, let's consider the importance and significance, because after all, development is supposed to benefit a number of parties and a number of stakeholders.
And many times I see that plans like these kind of divide the community between folks who want, for instance, a pavement for biking on the road.
Correct.
Others who want to acknowledge and respect the history and sacred land that we have,
Correct.
particularly
Correct.
in New York City.
And it is oftentimes an exercise in sort of figuring out ways in which there are compromises. But you first have to start with making the voices of people a priority before you can do that.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing, Peggy. Nick, you did mention the article earlier. We actually do have a photo of it. Can you just share how challenging it was to find these pieces of vital information in New York and the Bronx's history in particular?
Well, it certainly is a challenge because of the lack of records, and the enslaved community did not leave behind diaries and great documentation on their own lives. So we're really looking at censuses, we're looking at wills, various documents from the colonial period that make reference to the people that were here, the enslaved people that were here. And just to piggyback on what Peggy was saying, the development is interesting in the park because the park, it means so many different things to so many different people. It's a historical repository in some ways, but it's also a place where people come to run and to bike. And, the development of that trail actually paved the way, no pun intended, to have a team from the U.S. Department of Agriculture come in and do a scanning of the ground to detect, and they ended up detecting those burial sites. And without the development, I'm not even so sure that would have happened. So, it happened. It so happens that, the group that we're working with, the people in the Van Cortlandt Park Alliance and the Van Cortlandt House Museum, we're all pretty much on the same page as to seeing the significance of this spot. And it's, and that's what's allowing this marginalized history to come out now.
Stephanie, I'd love to have you chime in as well on, just preserving Van Cortlandt Park and inviting the community to understand the histories behind it as well, and the work that you're doing at the Alliance.
So we're working together to bring more programming. We had this beautiful, beautiful celebration on Juneteenth that was full of music and readings and community. And we want to continue to do programming like that for the public. So I invite people to come to the vancortlandt.org website to see what programs we have that we're planning going forward, but also to help support us in our endeavors as we try to present more programs that that apply to different ages, adults, children, families, and the like. And then, of course, the physical space in the park is something that we want to continue to improve. So we'd love to see a beautification project of the burial ground, and we look for help and assistance with that. And as we move forward, this is an incredibly rich sector in the park, and so there is room for daylighting of a stream, and that is a topic of conversation in the community for many, many years. It looks like that may happen soon, which would bring water to the surface, seeing the light of day. And that water body plays a role in the history of the enslaved people who lived and worked in the park. So it's all tied together. So like Nick is saying, people come to the park for different reasons. There's recreation, there's nature appreciation, but there is this rich, rich history that we want to be able to share and do more of.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Stephanie, Peggy, and Nick, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So Stephanie shared the vancortlandt.org website. We also have Kingsbridge Historical Society.org that you can visit to see their work, and Peggy King Jorde's website as well, KingJordeCulturals.com. Thank you all so much. We'll be right back here on Open BXRX Tuesday.